Welcome to our final and third session on simplified accountable structure. So welcome back, Blake, and I'm Kay Cotian. I think we're going to start with our simplified accountable process today, one of your favorite things. So get us started, Blake.
Sure. Sure thing. And as I get the next screen up here, I'll just say thank you for sticking with us through these videos. We hope that these are all helpful resources to you. This third section, we're going to talk about accountability some, and then we're also going to share some of the updates. You know, if you first heard about the simplified accountable structure, maybe called by a different title, 10 years ago, you might think, oh, I know all about this. I heard about this. I was trained in it. And so, well, we've changed. We've learned a lot in the last decade about this. And some of these lessons were hard learned lessons. And so we've discovered some stuff along the way. And we've dropped all that into our newest resources. But also as a superintendent, the churches you met up with may have systems that are pretty out of date compared to what actually works now. So that's the stuff we're going to be talking about in this section. So, but the first thing I want to share with you is the accountable leadership cycle. And this is a tool that we came up with, I believe, as part of our book Impact. And the idea was, what does it look like to visualize accountability? And we've talked about accountability in this session before. Yeah. And so this is a way to visualize that accountability. And as I try to lead people manage systems, I have this cycle of research, plan, act, evaluate, reflect. And of course, all of it comes out of the why, the purpose, the mission, the vision for impact that we have. And you see one of my coaching questions, what are your systems for holding ministries accountable? That's a fancy way of saying it, but you can get the idea. Is like, when's the last time you had a planning meeting setting goals before the ministry, instead of fire ready aim? When's the last time you evaluated? Another coaching question I use is, when's the last time you had a funeral for a ministry that wasn't working anymore? And, based upon this cycle, that's when it really gets from preaching to meddling right there. But you get the idea. But what the idea is that we must become proficient with assessment at every level. Assessment, accountability. And if this is the cycle that your leadership board uses, you can then take this cycle and say, pastors, as you work with staff, as you work with ministry team leaders, ministry teams, this is our system. How are we holding ourselves accountable to this cycle? So if we're doing like a bridge ministry event, a local park with the egg hunt, doing a community egg hunt in a local park, how's it fit into our purpose? Are we doing our research? How are we setting our goals? Are our goals just for how many members show up? Are they goals about new people and new guests? We implement, we evaluate, and then we'll get into all that in a second, but you get the idea how this can be spread throughout the whole system. So you're all using the same terminology. So accountability and assessment doesn't feel like something just the bigwigs on the board do. It is something that all of us do as Christian leaders, as Christian disciples. We're all holding ourselves accountable to the Great Commission. So let's take a look at this. With this process that you have before you on the slide, here's what I'll say. Assessment and evaluation and reflection, I believe these parts, because usually we're pretty good about discerning, well, we ought to do something. Sometimes we even do it with research. Many of us plan stuff, not always with goals, but that's a good thing to have. We're pretty good at implementing. We do lots of stuff. We stay very busy, don't we, Kay?
Oh, for sure.
Us Methodists, we love being busy.
For sure.
But let me back up a little bit there. When we do that discernment, we do talk about research. We do have an expectation of how does this fit into the needs of the community? On setting goals, the question is how the goals reach back into that purpose. If our goal for an event, for like a bridge event, is to reach new people, how are we planning so that we're reaching new people? You get the idea. And then so we're working this cycle. And so we wanted you to be conversant in this cycle because we share it in the book, we share it in the resources. And it's a tool for you as a superintendent to go, okay, how is this group using accountability and discernment along with the pastor? Now, I'll often get asked about the difference between evaluation and reflection. And here's how I'll put it here. Constant and consistent evaluation, all levels, that's really required so that church can be fruitful. But the board particularly, but I think all groups, but board particularly needs to move beyond simply evaluating, did we do the goals or not? But a larger question is, how are we living into this larger mission? Yes, this was a successful event, but evaluation can never say whether or not the event actually fulfilled our larger disciple-making task. Is an event we should have done in the first place. Because churches, once we do an event once, and now it becomes the first annual, whatever, and we can't really stop anything. So the question then on reflection is really, what are we learning? How are we leading? And so there is a difference between reflecting and evaluating there. So that's a tool that it's really designed, again, it's not about blaming, it's about learning.
Yeah.
So
and the other cool thing about when churches learn how to do this, and your leadership board is doing this work, and they also are wearing that hat of SPRC, doing pastoral evaluation, holding pastor accountable to church goals that they're working with ministry teams to actually implement, they have something to actually evaluate the pastor on, other than, did I personally like their sermon or not, or how well did they take care of my grandma when she was in the hospital, right?
Sure.
Because that's usually what happens is when we're not practicing accountability or we're not doing strategic planning, we really don't have an evaluation process other than personal opinions.
Assessment becomes anecdotal.
Correct.
And so by using this system, you can actually, to use an example, when you're moving as a staff parish, when you have that staff parish hat on as a board, they can say, okay, Pastor, how did you and those team do discernment and research? Did you ask questions? This is a great ministry idea, but is it actually designed for our community, or is it an idea that was designed for a church 1,000 miles away that you just tried to drop into a context that didn't fit in? You can ask about goals. Did you set goals that were based upon the actual vision? If you're having an egg hunt, you're not going to have the goal on how many eggs were collected. The real goal there is not how many eggs are collected. It's how many new people are you able to reach and get names and to be able to do follow-up on, right? So asking those kind of questions as you go through the cycle allows a larger evaluation and a larger reflection upon ministry and not just anecdotes. So that's one of those tools. The next tool we wanted to give our superintendents here is a lot of clarity around the responsibilities of governance. When so many functions of leadership are combined into one body, that body needs to be extremely clear about its identity and its boundaries and its expectations. So, Kay, share with us, please, what are these responsibilities of governance when you combine everything like we have in SAS?
Boy, our church councils usually ride in the management lane. That is where they are used to riding. And so one of these adaptive shifts is to get them to ride in the governance lane. Because let me just tell you, it is a lane you can drive pretty safely in and pretty quickly in, because there's not very many that are over in that lane. And so when we're talking about governance, it's kind of like this ambiguous term, because we're not familiar with it because we haven't practiced it. So it's stewardship. So it's that trustee and finance piece, right? And that's the one we probably understand more than any that we have been practicing. So it's taking care of the building, taking care of the legal pieces. It's taking care of the financial pieces. So all of our assets and making sure that we're protecting those assets. And then how are we leveraging those assets for missional and visional reasons. Now, here's where we're getting into new territory. and that is the generative. So we're making work for ourselves, if you can believe it. So what are we doing? How are we creating the steps so that we are living into God's preferred future for the church? So if the mission is making disciples, part of the discerning work is, so what's God's preferred future, the vision, the unique way that we make disciples in that local context, the local church, and helping us as a congregation to discern those. And then it's a leadership board's responsibility to figure out what are those steps, right? And that's usually done through a strategic ministry planning retreat, which is part of the SAS coach's responsibility in that first year, is to take them through that process the first time, so they're leaving behind kind of that practice and that rhythm and those tools, so that they can do that in the ongoing years. And then the strategic work is making sure that we're leveraging and looking at the congregational priorities. So we are looking at what are our core values of the congregation and making sure that that is all aligning. But we're also looking at our context. What is transitioning in our context, meaning our mission field, where the church is situated, and how are we remaining relevant in our context, which means, if we're not reaching new people, what do we need to do in order to be more relevant? What things do we need to shift in our ministry? How do we need to be more deployed? So again, it's those balcony kind of things that we just haven't typically done, Blake, that we have to do. And so this is where, again, having someone help us climb on the balcony and stay on the balcony is important. And then this accountable piece to say, okay, how are we doing at looking at the mission and vision? How are we doing with staying out of that management goal, or out of that management lane? How are we doing with accountability of having those conversations with our pastor, being encouraging, but also asking the questions of, so how's it going with those goals?
Right.
How's it going with those evaluations with the staff? So it looks like we're over on that budget line item. So what happened there? Was that intentional? Have you been watching that? Having the hard conversations, not putting our head in the sand and avoiding them, or having the parking lot conversations. Having those conversations when people have missed 3 meetings, when we have a leadership covenant that says once you miss 3, that you probably need to give up your seat and give it to someone who can have more regular attendance, right? We're willing to have those because we know that accountable leadership is an important value, and it helps us move forward. So it really is a whole new culture of leading for most churches in accountable leadership. And it changes the whole conversation. It's a different table, but it's a different agenda, and it's a whole new conversation than typically churches have been having.
And I think for us as superintendents, when we meet at church, it's really working in governance, and it's going, engines on all cylinders, able to go. We know the difference.
You feel
but it's also incumbent upon us not to try to redirect churches that are doing governance well back in that management lane, because that's what we're comfortable with, because maybe that's what we experienced in the past in organizations. And so the challenge for us as superintendents in this is to let the governing bodies do this governance work and help refine and articulate that governance work. When we go in and we hop into a system and do our DS thing, let's make sure we keep them at that governance level and make sure they're really clear where the management task lies in the pastor's role. And by being really well defined in that as superintendents, we can be building up health in local churches.
Yeah, which means when you would be doing that, but if you went into a SAS church leadership board and you begin to talk about individual ministry details, you would be taking them backwards, right? That would be an example.
There you go.
Right?
There you go. Yeah. Yep. Okay. So we talked about some governance here. The other thing that leadership boards need is some boundaries.
Wow.
And
This is one
yeah,
of my favorite things, Blake. You know this.
I know.
And this is one of the hardest things for churches to wrap their brain around, and it's the last thing that they normally implement. But this is one of the most life-giving pieces about simplified accountable structure. But it's sometimes one of the pieces that churches make way more complicated than it needs to. Okay. The easiest way that I can say it is guiding principles allow leadership boards to make macro decisions instead of micro decisions. Okay. So, an example, I had one church I was working with in New York, and the administrative secretary would take building usage applications for a month and just pile them in her basket. And then she would bring the whole pile to and this was simplified structure, by the way, she would bring them to the chair and say, okay, here's all the ones that you all need to go through and approve. And they would go through application after application and improve them one by one. And it's like, you're doing what? And it's like, well, but we have to make sure. And it's like, what criteria are you using? And so they began to tell me, and I said, that's your guiding principle. You write the criteria, give your administrative secretary the criteria, and give her permission. Here, give her the authority, give her the responsibility. See, accountable leadership to make those decisions. And only if it falls outside the parameters, then you get the exceptions. Or you then maybe give your pastor or another person on staff secondary approval, outside of that. And then only it comes to you out of that. Make macro decisions instead of every application. Go back to, I think we talked about in session 1, we talked about that building maintenance team. Do not approve every expense. Say, anybody on the building maintenance team can spend X number of dollars for any maintenance item. The building maintenance team leader can spend, this higher level. Or they have this open account at the hardware store. Give them that permission, because you're going to trust people, or you're not going to put them on the team. Allow them to do their ministry within the boundaries that you as the leadership team feel comfortable with. Right. And so it's, how do we say yes so that we, the leadership board, are not the bottleneck? It's a permission giving way of doing ministry, saying we trust you, we give you the authority, we give you the responsibility, but we're going to hold everyone accountable in the meantime. Right. We don't give permission because we don't hold people accountable, is what has happened in churches. Right.
Well, yeah, and this picture is a great image of it. Right here, we have a fence around the playing field.
Yep.
There's a fence around. If you can't go past the boundaries.
Yep. And
there's some lines on the ground that have some basic rules of how you need to be and how you play that game.
Yep.
And so really, once you design the playing field and you have the fence,
yep,
let them play ball.
You bet.
Let them enjoy themselves. Let them have fun and do ministry.
Yeah.
A phrase I use in this is boards can delegate, but they can't abdicate.
That's right. Yep. Yep. It's a beautiful thing. And so, but it's important to help them walk through that to get them started. But once they kind of get started, they see the value in it. And I always say to boards, make decisions. And then there's that secondary filter to say, could there be a guiding principle in place that if there were, whoever was waiting on this decision wouldn't have had to wait for us to do it the next time?
Now, as superintendents, one thing to be really clear of is do not try to require guiding principles to become something akin to bylaws.
Oh,
in other words, the church council, the leadership board, that group can change these guiding principles in the meeting. Don't have to have a bunch of notice. You don't have to have a charge conference.
Yeah.
I mean, you may have a charge conference to set the initial, but then it says in it, the board may then amend it as needed. Give freedom to the board to do their work and to create these. So superintendent, don't make it worse or more complicated than it needs to be.
This is an operational guide. more than anything else. This allows day-to-day operations to occur without having to wait on the board to make any decisions, right? And so that's why it's not book of discipline kind of stuff. It really is about a permission giving kind of tool. I always call it's a living, breathing document.
Mhm.
And it has to be accessible because it can change from time to time, because we do want it to be a permission giving tool. So yeah, I try not to make it part of anything, right? Because again, it's a beautiful living thing, not something that we want to complicate with charge conference and book of discipline and all that stuff.
Yeah, I received some guiding principles in church wanting to switch over, and it was I took a pen and a red line that said, "Do not require charge conference." I mean, let's not even go there. We want to create some freedom in this.
You bet.
So, Kay, the next thing we need to talk about is there's some gaps.
Yeah.
Why don't you help us get kind of organized here on me?
Yeah. So this is kind of our sharing some of the
Mhm.
common things that we have found in churches, just so you're aware what you might be finding. There is, first of all, communication. We shared with you clear back in session 1 that sometimes the way they go about getting into simplified accountable structure wasn't always the best. And they did it with a charge conference with only 3 people, and that caused some problems. But also because 50 people aren't in the room or whatever the number is for church council, it's like, oh, well, how are we going to know what's going on if we don't go to the church council meeting because 50 people aren't involved? That wasn't about the structure. That's a communication problem, right? But we have to learn to communicate in ways that don't require a meeting. So we actually help them through that with a piece on the agenda. That's one of the ways that we get around that. But we also talk about quarterly town hall meetings until we really begin to live into this model to help with those communication pieces. The other thing is because we aren't used to leadership covenants, we don't always understand or know how to hold one another accountable for those leadership covenants. And we demo that again in that accountability video. And again, that's another reason to have a coach, is when those things come up, to help you lead through one of those things. We help the leadership board learn how to use a packet with a consent calendar kind of thing to kind of move things along. They don't always use that well. Staying in governance mode is sometimes difficult. I think the other thing is, to move from a congregant where you can talk about anything and move into a leader that has the back of your pastor and know what's appropriate to talk to your friend as a fellow congregant, to what's appropriate to talk about with your friend as a leader. Sometimes that's kind of a little hard shift as well. And they don't always see the value in investing in coaching and therefore circumvent it. And they don't get equipped, nor do they have that coaching. And therefore, they only move into simplified structure. It blows up. Then they say, simplified structure doesn't work. And they're right, because they never did it. They just think they did. Right?
Yeah. So there's also some potholes or some gaps in adaptive changes, because this is adaptive change, not just technical. First blush, a lot of people assume this is only a technical change, but it's really a whole new way of doing business. You'll notice in this column that the communication is the first thing again, because we have to change how we do communications. And of course, I have a little banner or some sticker someone gave me that said I attended a meeting that should have been an email. Yeah. They gave me that, and I don't think it was a loving gift, but it was a loving gift with a little bit of sarcasm, because that's how my friends are. But it
was not me, by the way.
No, it wasn't you. It was one of my board chairs when I was a pastor. And oh golly, I deserved it. But communication comes first. Another change is the agenda. You'll see a sample agenda in the resources of our book that changes the way we do business. In other words, there's not a reading of the minutes and all. It's just a new way to do business, because if you take the old agenda, Robert's Rules of Order, old business, new business, work through all that, do discussion that way, it will drag you back into the mud. And it will not be accountable leadership. It'll be leadership by who wins debates. And that is not a way to build the kingdom of God. Compatible room setup is even talked about. And that comes from some experiences. I don't know about you had that, but I've had, Kay, and I was working with the congregation I was visiting with. And I remember I walked in the room, the first time I'd been in that church, and it was the whole board was set up in a row looking at an audience of chairs. Yep. And there was microphones set up, and it reminded me of a school board meeting. Yep. Or even worse, there was that TV show Parks and Rec where people come up and they say weird stuff on the microphone to the board and shake their finger. And that's how they ran their meetings. And I'm like, no wonder this is, you got to set up room to build community, to build, and so that actually matters. That is a change that changes the whole temperature in the room.
You bet.
The way you do the room setup. Another point we make a point of is having this strategic ministry planning with the board, and then follow it with team leaders and staff. I've seen it where they flip that, okay, where staff goes first, and they basically tell the board, here's our priorities. Right. That is flip-flop what it needs to be, because that is moving staff into a role that they are not designed to hold. You bet. And then moving from reporting and maintenance into those generative and this other work that we've been describing over these past couple of slides. The last piece that's adaptive is work groups. Work groups are one of the newer items that we've grown into with simplified accountable structure, Kay. And I think we're both excited about it, because folks were thinking, well, if you're reducing that many different positions, what about these really gifted leaders? And of course, the first thing we say is they need to be leading ministry teams and small groups. They need to be leading people to be closer disciples of Jesus. But there are sometimes skills, we need some of their skills in leadership. And so using work groups, you can pull in some of these leaders for a season. They may not want to sign up for a 3-year term, but they will help design your next personnel policy. Right. Or they will help you design this year's budget. And then they can jump back in the pew and out of that, because they've used their skills well. Yeah. That's also a place for some leaders that have a lot of wisdom and experience in the life of the church, where you can pull those wisdom and resources in, and then let them get back to their retirement that they deserved from leadership. And they really wanted to lead the mission team, and they didn't want 3 years worth of leadership, but you still need their wisdom on something. Or a brand new leader that's an incoming leader, and this is a way to give them a sneak peek into what it's like to be at that leadership table by putting them on a work team. So there's several different ways you can utilize those work teams in adaptive ways to really build up the leadership capacity of your church. It's not just these 9 people are the only leaders in the church. Oh, golly, we have leader disciples all over the place, and we're using them. And that leadership type, that's next. Why don't you share a little bit about that?
Yeah. And Blake, I don't know that we specifically said it. So just to make sure that we make it clear, in case there's a district superintendent that's hearing this, that means we no longer use or recommend at all the use of representatives at all in the leadership model. And this whole work team piece is kind of the replacement of that to some degree, but it works a whole lot differently. So I don't think we had inherently said that specifically. So I just wanted to make sure that came through as well. So as we think about other gaps in leadership, again, look what shows up, communication again. And so even starting from, the board chair and the pastor getting together to put, that agenda together every time. They don't always do that. Sometimes the pastor overleads or the chair overleads. It's that collaborative piece. We're not used to having hard conversations. And this shows up again. So that's another thing that we're having to lean into. And then Sometimes we don't always get those town hall meetings in to communicate or provide opportunities for two-way conversation. Sometimes it's only one-way conversation. And I think I mentioned this earlier, is not to get those guiding principles in place or then to enforce them. Sometimes we just want to roll the leaders from the old structure right into the new structure. Or we don't want to rotate, because just in the new structure, we have 3 classes, just like we did in traditional structure. They're there for a reason. We need fresh perspective. We need people to roll in, to give us different gifts, and we need different personalities to roll in. They're there out of wisdom, and I think we need to make sure that we're doing that. Sometimes we have relatives, and we still have those same things where we don't always abide by that, where we have, the church secretary's mother on the board. Still need to watch for that. We put some rhythms about, what do we need to be thinking about in January that's going to be coming up in the spring. That was a gift we gave in the book, but that is something new. We're always kind of like, oh my gosh, what's coming up next week? And that is a new thing to kind of lean into as well. And we mentioned this earlier too, is maybe we might do that initial training the first year, but then we think we got it, and then we don't do the ongoing training. And that really, that is detrimental, because when we only do one class, then we lose the steam, and then it doesn't get embedded into the culture of the church. We go right back to the old way.
Yeah. That's what everyone's comfortable with.
Yeah.
And if you're a new member of a committee and of the board, and your only experience was on finance committee 4 years ago, and you come back, you'll bring that expectation to the new leadership board table, and that will take us backwards instead of forwards.
You bet.
So that again, these are some potholes or gaps or things that we've seen over the last couple of years, best practices. We also have done a lot of talk about how we can do accountability and do some of that training in a new way. And you've alluded this a few times about this leadership accountability video. What is that composed of?
So again, we talked about it. You showed the model. That's been in the book for quite some time. We have been using Winning on Purpose as a resource, but still it's like, how does that feel? How do we practice it? And it was still this, I don't know how to do it. So we put a team of characters together, and we modeled kind of what a simplified, accountable, structured board meeting would look like, and gave you some insights on what accountability looks like and what it doesn't look like. We gave you some best practices and not so good practices, and we did indicate which was which, by the way. And then Blake and I kind of emceed it to kind of help unpack those practices and talk about those a little bit. And this is just as kind of a fun training, teaching tool to kind of help identify what accountability looks like. We had fun with it, and we just hope it's
we try to take a humorous take on it. And so it's a fun tool to show to boards, and it's only like 40 minutes long. So it's an easy tool to show as part of your in-house training, as people are trying to imagine what this needs to look like, and with these examples. So again, these are all tools that we've created over the past few months and few years. The thing we wanted to be sure, though, to be clear, is there's a reason why we're in version 3 of Mission Possible, and that is stuff we're saying now is not all the stuff we used to say.
Oh, for sure.
And I've recommended stuff I'm pulling back on, because I'm trying to be a learning person, not just a saying person. So we have some shifts, and the first one I'll share, then I'll kind of pass the baton, is, and you said this earlier, is moving from representatives to work teams. Here's the problem with representatives. When I say representatives, what I'll say is 10 years ago, and in some of the other models being talked about around the connection, they'll say, oh, you need like 3 staff parish and 3 trustees and 3 finance, and that makes your board. Here's the problem with that. First of all, it's not disciplinary. You can't not just have 3 staff parish people. That goes against the discipline. It doesn't help. Another problem, we kept on seeing folks whose understanding of their identity is, I came in here as a staff parish person. In other words, they didn't come in as a leader disciple of the board. And so that specialist idea or the representative, it was taking us backwards to the old system. And we never made those adaptive changes. The other thing that was happening is those subgroups or those specialists or reps were meeting on their own outside the committee and making the decisions. And in some cases, deciding whether or not they wanted the pastor to return, and then just telling the board. And that meant the board, which had the legal authority as staff parish, never voted on some really important stuff. Yeah. So it was creating a bit of a mess there. And that was the common idea then. We on ours, we are now pushing work teams instead as a way to meet that need of getting expertise, but let's do it in a legal way and keep very much clarity of roles when it comes to your board.
Yeah. And the idea behind that, Blake, was to be helpful in imagining how that work could be done between meetings, right? But they took it literally and took authority that they didn't have. And it just created also, I mean, this is one of those learnings where we were trying to be helpful and it was more hurtful, right? So yeah, it didn't work, as you say. Pull that one back. And again, we talked about this in our first session, is the single board alternative structure. Again, took it literally, almost killed some churches because they took away nominations and all of that in that learning. And that is not what we call it anymore. Simplified, accountable structure. We used to say 9 to 13 because it gave you some flexibility. Again, in really understanding the Book of Discipline, there are some of those committees that say maximum 9, which really then by Book of Discipline meant that 4 of those people shouldn't have been voting, and they were voting and making those decisions so that everyone can vote and we don't have to figure out who can and who can't. It's just much cleaner to have 9 people, right? Yep. I think there's some other shifts we've made, right?
Yeah. First of all, the emphasis need for the 3 phases. That is something we introduced just as recently over the past couple of years. That's again to bring clarity to folks because we were finding, just trying to eat this elephant all at once with churches when they were trying to take in the resources was just simply not possible. And different people needed different resources at different times in the process on your larger congregation. So we separated out those processes. Chair is also the lay leader, the DS liaison, in other words, staff parish chair, DS liaison, and trustee chair. That being the same person, that we have found to be very important because it's clarity of contact for your DS. Because what happens when you don't have that same person, and I've still got a few in my district, it triangulates. And there's lack of clarity on who's responsible and in charge, and it does, again, create some confusion. And the last thing we need is more confusion when we talk about our governing systems. Exactly. The other piece is shift from a secular experience to mature disciples. I've seen folks ask me, do I need to have, again, an HR person, someone good at numbers and all? No, you need disciples of Jesus who can lead at the balcony level. That's what you're looking for. The other stuff you'll bring in as needed. But you really need to focus on mature disciples. And I've seen churches, they try to bring someone in that has those skills, but may not be in their faith life where they need to be. And they come in and they're not helpful to the group's dynamic. Yep. Sometimes they're not personally invested and they're not even, maybe not even givers to the church, and they're involved in making decisions. And it hurts the whole accountability of your system when that happens. Now, we also have really grown in our understanding of the nominating committee, haven't we, Kay? You bet. Because it's just not the nominations committee. It's a longer name. And sometimes, when we have shortened it, we forget the bigger role because it's leadership development, nominations and leadership development. So sometimes
people take that job because it's like, oh, they only have to work a month or two a year. But it really is intended to be a year-round equipping role. So they are equipping, developing leaders so that when it comes time for nominations, they already have leaders ready to go. So then we have leaders equipped, ready to go into the leadership board because they've spent time with them. And, going through that application and interview process, how are you living out your life of a disciple? How are you maturing? Are you in worship? Are you a tither or moving towards the tithe? What does your daily prayer life look like, your devotion life? There is really an accountability to your discipleship before there's an accountability of a leadership, because we're gonna make sure you're a disciple before we put you in a leadership role of modeling a spiritual leader for your church, right? Because we're lifting them into that spiritual leadership role in our church. And I think it's important to put those people that you want as models in those places. So it has to start with your nominations, understanding that first, so that they're putting those kind of peoples in those roles. So if we haven't gotten it through yet, we're going to try one more time. Communication is key, right? Communication is key. That was an issue even before simplified accountable structure, but it kind of amplifies it because there's fewer people that are usually involved in some of these conversations. And so we just have to be more intentional about it.
The way I've kind of talked about it is, if you had 4 committees of 9 people that were talking about whatever the subject matter is, but now you have one group of 9 people, you have to multiply your communication times 4 just to equal what you used to have.
Right.
And what you used to have probably was a lot of people saying, I don't understand what's going on around here. We need more communication. That tells you how much more you need to communicate.
You bet.
One of the things that we even do is, in the latest version of the agenda that we share, the sample agenda, we have an item that says communication. In other words, you end every single meeting of the board. What do we communicate, and on what venues and methods do we use to communicate it? Yeah. And that makes a huge difference in a meeting when you close out, not with, oh, okay, let's do closing prayer, we're out of here. No. We're going to close with, what did we accomplish that we need to get out there to the rest of the church?
What's the message, and who's going to be the messenger?
Who is responsible for it? In other words, who's accountable?
You bet. You bet. And they're like, oh, that's a really good idea. We never thought about that. Is usually what I get when exactly. And I think the one just kind of final note here is, and I hope this has become pretty evident through these 3 kind of pieces that we have shared with you as district superintendents, is we just continuously create tools that are trying to be helpful, so that we are able to provide resources, so that we are able to help churches live faithfully and fruitfully into this model. Because again, this is not a revitalization tool, but what we have found is that when churches live into this, they truly have a much better chance of being more missionally focused and reaching people for Christ than any other thing that we have seen. So that's our hope and our prayer. That's our intention, and continuously to put a lot of effort into Mission Possible is we have just seen it as a vital resource for so many churches. And we just hope that this has been helpful to you as a new district superintendent or some other adjudicatory leader. And we just appreciate you investing so much of your time in viewing these videos. Just hope it's been helpful.
Super. And we have these tools on our web pages, and you see kcotan.com and blakebradford.org. We, of course, have Mission Possible version 3.0 plus coming out, and it may already be out by the time you watch this video. And it includes, I'm super excited about this, 40 pages just designed only for district superintendents and adjudicatory leaders. In other words, we created stuff just for you, sort of a special edition for all of us. And we in that material, we have information how to do this at the district level, which as a district superintendent, I tell you what, it can make a huge difference in your whole ministry if you're doing simplified accountable structure in your system as well. So I hope you enjoy this. Kay, thank you so much for being with us. To all of our new district superintendents and judicatory leaders here at what we lovingly call Charm School. I'm excited for your journey. I'm excited for you to be a fellow colleague and district superintendent to me, and of course, a partner to both of us in your journey of leadership. Many blessings to you.
Yeah, let us know if we can be helpful to you in your ministry as it relates to simplified accountable structure. And thank you for your ministry as a judicatory leader. Thank you very much.